Can you hear me? Is that good? Okay. Good to have everybody back. Had a great crowd this morning. Lots of visitors. I did not count. I don't know who did the count this morning. 79. That's a great crowd. Good, lots of visitors. Had some restoration. These are days that you kind of hate to go home, because then you got to deal with Monday. So it was a great day, and I'm glad to see so many back here this afternoon. We finished up Leviticus, and because Brother William just begged me to, I got a test for you. Sit down. I'm not going to give a test. Leviticus. Listen, even the people who lived under it couldn't do it right? So I'm not going to ask everybody to take a test on Leviticus. But I really enjoyed doing it, and I haven't had anybody ask me for notes yet. But just let everybody know, if you need notes from the class, let me know. I'll be happy to get those to you. I will tell you this: I got a lot of, besides my personal study and my whatever, I'm trying to think of the word. My study, my not concordance, what's that? Comments. Thank you. I don't know why I kept wanting to say concordance. My commentary, besides my commentary and and the actual study from the text, I used Kaufman. Kaufman does a commentary on him as well. And if you go to his website, there's a Kaufman website. If you go there, you can get a lot of the information that I got. Just to let you know, if you ever want to do your own study, if there's anything there that kind of grabs your attention, you want to go for that. But that's where I got that from. But if you need my notes, feel free to let me know, and I'll be happy to give you anything that I've got. I asked, if there's anything that anybody wanted to study, and the only person that ever responded to me was actually my daughter, and she said it would be a good idea. Maybe why don't we talk about the lineage of Jesus Christ? And I thought, it may not lend itself to an entire quarter. I said, but it would certainly lend itself to a good study. So I thought, that might be pretty good for us. Book of Joshua would be a good one. As a matter of fact, we'll see what we can do. I'm always looking for something. I like to kind of vary it between the old and the new, between going by the book and maybe a topical study or something like that. But I'm always open to any kind of recommendations for sermons, anything. Please let me know, because I like to cover what people want to hear as well as what people need to hear. So anyway, I thought we could do a study for maybe 2 or 3 Sunday afternoons on the lineage of Jesus Christ, because there's a reason that it's mentioned. There's a reason it's mentioned in Scripture, and there's a reason that it's mentioned at the very beginning of the book of Matthew. There was a reason behind the lineage. There was a point behind how it got from this point to this point, and Jesus can trace his lineage unbroken all the way through to Adam. There's no point where there's not a clear record of who he was descended from. This was important, and we'll learn the reasons for that a little bit later on, but I thought we could talk about that. So, with that in mind, why don't we go ahead and turn to that, Matthew chapter 1. Let's see. We'll go ahead and pull it up on mine, but I will ask everybody if they would if I get a chance to read. Okay. Getting to Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1. I'm going to drink my coffee. I spoke a little bit more forcefully this morning than I normally do, so I've got to get some. All right, so Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1. Who'd like to read for me? How about reading, whoever has this, let's go ahead and read the first 3, if you don't mind some of those names. Matthew 1, verses 1 through 3. Okay, Miss Sybil's going to read that for us. Okay, here we go. Okay, verses 4, 5, and 6. If you still, anybody feeling froggy? 4, 5, and 6. Yes, ma'am. Okay. One more, just a little bit further. Okay. Anybody? Okay, 7, 8, and 9. Okay, Heather?
Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of
Isaiah.
And Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah.
All right. 10 and 11.
And Ezekiel begat Manasseh, and Manasseh begat Amon, and Amon begat Josiah, and Josiah begat Jeconiah and his brethren, about the time they were carried away into Babylon.
All right. Fill up the one more verse.
And after they were brought to Babylon, Jeconiah begat Salathiel, and Salathiel begat Zorobabel.
Okay. And anybody else? 13, 14, and 15. I could read it. I haven't read anything so far. I was letting you guys do the heavy carrying. Zerubbabel begot Abiud. Abiud begot Eliakim. Eliakim begat Azor. Azor begot Zadok. Zadok begot Achim. And Achim begot Eliud. Eliud begot Eleazar. Eleazar begot Mathan. And Mathan begot Jacob. And Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. Now, so all the generations from Abraham to David are how many? 14. From David until the captivity in Babylon are, and from the captivity in Babylon until the Christ are, okay. So, after this point, of course, in verse 18 and following, it talks about the conception and the birth of Jesus Christ. But it's important that Matthew gives an idea of the generations of Jesus. Why was this important? Why was this important for these generations to be listed? Okay, it fulfilled a prophecy. What was the prophecy? Okay, that he would be from the tribe of Judah. Also, remember, Abraham was the first one listed. What was the promise to Abraham? Yes. From his seed, all the nations of the world would be blessed. Well, how were the nations of the world blessed? Through Jesus Christ. The only way in which the entire nations of all the world would be blessed in the kind of way that God was going to bless them. All the promises that were given to Abraham were fulfilled. He was given a nation promise. He was given a land promise. The seed promise, though, was one that was going to be what we would call a slow burn. Have you ever seen those comedy movies where somebody makes a joke and it kind of just sits there for a couple minutes? They call it a slow burn, where all of a sudden it's revealed and everybody, okay, now we're in on the joke. Well, this is no joke. The promise to Abraham that through his seed the nations of the world would be blessed was a slow. You think about it, 14 generations from Abraham until David. From David till the carrying away was another 14. From the carrying away until Jesus was 14. So 14 generations, not 14 years, 14 generations went by before the birth of Jesus Christ. And it was still another 30 plus years until the promise of Christ dying on the cross. So this was a very slow process, but it was like anything. It was like a glacier moving. It's inexorable. It's not going to be stopped. Jesus is both the irresistible force and the immovable object. You ever heard that thing? What happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable object? It's an unanswerable question. But we know that Jesus is both. It's an irresistible force. It's going to happen. Because what's going to happen when this world is done? Every knee is going to bow. What's going to dislodge that rock? Nothing. Nothing can. So it's so interesting to watch God setting this in motion. Now, that's not going back as far as the generations from Adam to Abraham either. And when was Jesus really foretold? First book of the Bible, we read about the foretelling of Jesus Christ. I mean, at the very beginning, it talks about the serpent and how the serpent's head is going to be crushed, not bruised as the heel of Jesus, but crushed as the head of the serpent. So it's essential that we read this in Matthew, and it's essential that Matthew writes this down. Who is Matthew writing this book to? Is he writing it to the Jews or the Gentiles? He's writing it to the Jews. The Jews, the genealogy was essential. Why was it essential? So that we could prove who Jesus was, for one. We knew who his parentage was. There was no disproving his lineage. I mean, he lists the generations. And the great thing about it is, while Jesus was alive, the temple was still in place. The temple was still in place. What was in place in the temple? The genealogies, all those records. So they could go back and they could say, well, he says he's from, and they could trace his lineage because they would write that down. The genealogies were absolutely essential to the Jews. Why was that? Why was it essential? They would know who. They would know who the priesthood was. They knew if they were eligible for the priesthood. Who were the Levites? Well, we know who they were because we could trace their lineage and we could go back and go back and go back. So we know that this was essential for Matthew to write down. And this was written after the death of Christ. He wasn't writing this as he went. This was written after the fact. All right? So let's go through this just a little bit. And we're going to go through really quickly this, but then we're going to drop back next week and we're going to kind of go a little slower and kind of talk about some of these things going on. All right, so we know that this particular portion of the scripture, verses 1 through 17, so to speak, roundabout, this is the book of the generation or the genealogy. So it's essential to genealogy. And genealogy is the Genesis. Who was the beginner? Who began this and who began this and this person begat this? Who does this go through? Does this go through the mother side or the father side? Look at some of the people who were mentioned though. There were some women that were mentioned, correct? Okay, so this is essential, and we'll see that a couple of these were not Israelites. They were not Hebrew, right? Who were some of the people that were not Hebrew? Well, which were these people? Who were the people that were not Hebrew? Rahab and who else? Ruth. She was a Moabitess. Okay, she was not an Israelite. Okay, so there were people mentioned in the genealogy of Christ that were not Hebrew, but their husbands were. So we know that the genealogy comes through the father all the way through, even though there were people. So it's interesting the fact that even back then God was showing that it was Gentile and Jew, and their course of history was interlinked. It wasn't to the Jew. Jesus was. It may have been a small percentage, but he was not 100% pure-blooded Hebrew from the very beginning. There was some outlying blood that was in that. But that's something that God wants us to know. And he certainly didn't dislodge those people from their history simply because they were not Hebrew. Okay? Well, they were essential. Yeah, they were essential to the story. And God, once again, puts them in a place that they need to be. You know, as he did with who? Esther. Remember? That's the one I was thinking of. Who knows if God has put you in such a place at such a time? That's exactly what he did with Rahab. I mean, if Rahab wasn't there, what was going to happen to those spies? They could have been caught and killed. All right? Ruth was essential for Ruth because what was the problem with Ruth's husband? No children. Okay? Ruth. It was through Ruth that he was able to have children. Okay. So anyway, it's essential that these women be there, but it also goes to show that this is not 100% Israelite. They're not 100% Hebrew blood in here. All right. So the book of the generations or genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David. This is important. All right. We got to know that Jesus was the son of David. Why? Because David was Jesse's son. He was from the tribe of Judah. And he was the greatest of the kings, right? He was the greatest of the kings, but was he the greatest king? No. All right. But it also shows that that Jesus came through the bloodline that would have generated a king. So he was also part of the kingly lineage. All right. So continue on. Somebody want to read 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 16. 2 Samuel 7 and verse 16. If you would turn there. And if you get there, go ahead and read it. Again, that's 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 16. Okay. Now, the word forever here is important. What does the word forever here mean? Okay. When it says forever, does that mean, is that limited to our physical time here on this earth? Okay. What does it say about the Lord's church? Does the Lord's church die on that judgment day? Does the Lord's church cease to exist? No, the church is forever, and that's one thing that God has promised the Christian. The church is established, and it is established forever. It's not just a physical church. It is a spiritual church. The kingship that God has promised to David is not merely a physical kingship. It is a spiritual kingship, because we know that Jesus Christ was the last of the kings, right? He's the last. He was the culmination of that kingly lineage, and it culminates and it ends with Jesus Christ. He is, as the word of some say, the once and future king. He is the king now, and he is the king, and he reigns forever. And his kingship could never be taken away. And this is what God's promising to David. He's not just saying that your fleshly seed is going to sit on the throne. He's also saying that through you, this kingship that I've given to you can never be taken away. It's forever. It's an eternal kingship, and that kingship, of course, now our king is Jesus Christ, and he reigns, and he will remain, and he will always remain. It's a permanent thing. It's forever. Okay, John chapter 7 verse 42. Book of John chapter 7 and verse 42. So we know that the Messiah himself was promised to David. And this is what it means when he says that Jesus is the son of David. Certainly not his physical son, but it's through David's loins that the king of Judah, the forever king of Judah, is to come. John chapter 7, verse 42. Okay. So we now know that not only did he come from the same house of David, he also comes from the same hometown as David. David was from Bethlehem. Okay? So this is trying to establish in the mind of the Jew, or the Hebrew, the Jew that would be reading this, that would be reading this gospel for the first time, to know, listen, set your minds at ease, because this would have been something very important. They're looking for a king after the line of David. And if Jesus doesn't fulfill this, they can rightly discard him as a king. If he's not from the tribe of Judah, if he's not from the line of David, they can rightly discard him and disregard him as king. And we should as well, because the scripture tells us that the king, the permanent king of Israel, the permanent king of the world, comes from the line of David. So he's trying to make sure he's getting in their mind immediately. He said, Jesus is from the line of David, and now I'm going to show you through the generations exactly how it occurs. Keep your mind at ease. Now, this is also important to us today. While all the genealogies have been destroyed, when the temple was sacked in 70 A.D. by the Romans, all of those records were destroyed. It was God's stamp mark on the death knell of Judaism. Now, there are those who still believe in Judaism today. They still practice it. You have 3 different schools of thought with Judaism. And you still have, unfortunately, in the evangelistic mindset of some in this country, that there is going to be a future kingdom of Judah. Okay? The Israel is going to come back, and it's once again going to sit on its rightful place. We know that we can disregard that half-hearted prophecy. There's no such thing. God's stamp mark on the destruction of Judaism was in AD 70 when the temple was sacked. However, it is still important for us to know that Jesus came from the line of David, because we're part of that promise as well, and we want to know. We want to make sure. We want to make sure that all of the prophecy that's been up to this point is correct. All right. So, continuing on, we know that Jesus was the son of David from that Davidical kingly line. He's also what? The son of Abraham. And we read this in Genesis chapter 22, verse 18. If you want somebody who wants to turn there, Genesis chapter 22 and verse 18. And whoever gets that, if you want to read it, I also need somebody to read Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16. Mm-hmm. Okay. So when God's promising this to Abraham, could all of the nations of the world would all of the nations of the world come from the loins of Abraham? Is that possible? Could every person in the world be descended from Abraham? Okay, that's illogical. So how could all of the nations of the world be blessed through Abraham, except through Jesus Christ? Okay, because only the descendants of Abraham had access to the promises, the land promise and the nation promise. Those were the only people who came from the loins of Abraham. Those who were descended from him had access to those promises. But there was still a promise that the rest of the nations of the world would be blessed. The only way that could happen is through the messiahship of Jesus Christ. Okay, so he's making sure that he's making sure that he understands your behavior towards me, your obedience to me is going to have an effect, a far-reaching effect that you can't begin to imagine. You know, Abraham's listening to this. He has a very limited worldview. He hasn't seen everybody. He hasn't been all over the world yet. He's traveling, but he hasn't seen everything yet. And here's God telling him, because of your obedience to me, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And he's like, well, that sounds great. I'm still waiting on the land promise. You know, Abraham never saw that land. That was not part of his. That was not going to be part of his history. He was going to die long before that was established. But he's listening to this and he's hearing that promise, and you know he's keeping it. He's treasuring it up. He said, you know, I'm grateful. I'm thankful for that. I'm just going to continue doing what I'm supposed to be doing. You know, kind of like what we do today. If you think about it, we have a promise, and we're not going to see that for quite some time. In many cases, we're going to die, and who knows how long after we die that the Lord allows this world to continue. We don't know. But we continue to obey and to observe the commandments of God, and we do it with a promise that's maybe still be even afar off. Okay? Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16. Galatians 3:16. Anybody got that? Okay. So what's the promise? What's the promise through the seed? Okay, and what's the promise through Christ? There's a promise that we have through Christ. What's that promise? Salvation, right? Being at home with God. Now, that kind of flies in the face of a lot of people who believe that it's not only through the name of Christ that we're saved, right? The Muslims believe that through the commandments of Muhammad they're saved. Not to get too far into world religions, the Hindus believe that through obedience to and sacrifice to their various gods, that there's a state of, I guess, a state of nirvana is achieved, where we're at one with the universe. You know, there's a promise, but that promise only comes through certain things. But we know that there's only one seed in which we can be blessed, that we have that promise, and that promise is a home, eternal home with God. Okay, so once again, it assures us that we don't need to be looking after or for anything else. We don't need to go after any other doctrine, any other commandments of men, because there's only one seed through which the world will be blessed, and that's Jesus Christ. All right? Okay, so verse 2. Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Judah and his brethren. Now, the Judah and his brethren, you notice that it says Judah and his brethren, and it's mentioned here because they're the heads of the tribes. Okay, these are the tribes of Jacob, and for whom especially Matthew wrote his gospel. This gospel that Matthew's writing is going out to the Jews. They're the ones that are going to be reading it, so they can see themselves in. It says Judah and his brethren. Well, the people who are reading this may not be from the tribe of Judah, but they know that it's going to come through. Remember, salvation comes what? Comes through the Jews. Doesn't come from anywhere else. Salvation comes through the Jews, and then it's extended to the Gentiles. So people reading this are saying, well, I'm not a member of the tribe of Judah, but because of the tribe of Judah, Jesus has been delivered to us, and I have part and parcel of that promise that's been given through the tribe of Judah. Okay, so they're just kind of reading themselves into this. And that's good for them to know. It's being written to them, and they need to know this. Okay, so Judah and his brethren, and then Judah begat Perez and Zerah. And these were twins. Okay, Perez and Zerah. of Tamar. And Tamar was who? She was the daughter-in-law of Judah. Remember? She was an incestuous daughter-in-law of Judah. Perez begat Hezron, and Hezron begat Ram. Ram begat Amminadab, and Amminadab begat Nahshon, and Nahshon begat Salmon. Salmon begat Boaz of Rahab. Okay, who was Rahab? She was a harlot. There's different schools of thought. I'm of the opinion that that was her calling, that was her occupation. There are those who believe that the word is misinterpreted, but I think it's safe to say that there's at least enough evidence there that would lead us to believe that she was a harlot. She was also a what? Where did she live? In the city of? Yep, Jericho. If she was living in Jericho and the nation of Israel was encamped about it, trying to overthrow it, what was she? She was a heathen and a pagan. I mean, she was one who was outside of the nation. So here we read about the first person outside of the nations that's listed in the lineage of Jesus Christ. So once again, here we get a hint of the nations of the world being blessed, not just the Jews, but also the Gentiles. And it also, we need to remember this, that through Jesus, there is no more Gentile or Jew. We're all one. That's important. Because what happens to Rahab? When the city is overthrown, what happens? She's not only spared, but what else? She is one of what they would call in the Greek a proselyte. She was one who acknowledged Jehovah God and chose to accept obedience to him and began to practice the faith, the law under Moses. Okay, so Salmon begat Boaz of Rahab, and Boaz begat Obed of Ruth. Once again, here we kind of veer off into outside of Israelite territory. Who's Ruth? She was a Moabitess. Okay, why was she? How did she come into the picture? Naomi's son. Okay, so Ruth was a daughter-in-law of a Israelite. She was a faithful Israelite who had moved outside of the territory. She was living outside, and when her husband died and 2 sons died, all the men in this household extinguished very quickly. And the decision was made. Naomi said, what? I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back to my family. I'm going to go back to my people. She knew that she would be taken care of by her people, but she couldn't guarantee that if she stayed where she would. She knew that if she went back, she would have much more opportunities and much more of a chance of survival if she went back home. So she had 2 daughters-in-law, and she said, I want you to go back to your own families as well. Because if they went back to their own families, they would be much more likely to find a husband than if they went back with her. Now, one of the daughter-in-laws said, I love you, I wish you well, but I'm going to go back to my people. And Ruth gives one of the most stirring statements to Naomi. You sense the love that's coming from her when she says what she says to Naomi. She says, I'm going to go where you go. And this was not just I'm desperate, I'm going to go wherever I can in order to get. She says, I love my mother-in-law. Apparently, Naomi was one of the decent women of the Bible. She loved her daughters-in-law. She wanted what was best for them, but she knew that if they came back, they may not get the kind of fair treatment maybe that they should. So she's going to send them home, and Ruth says, no, where you go, I go. And the thing, where you lodge, I lodge. And the greatest thing is at the end, your God will be my God. So this shows Naomi had a spiritual influence on Ruth. Ruth saw Naomi's complete obedience to her God. And she knew that the God that she worshiped was a good God, and it was a God that cared about his people. And she said, I don't want to delve too much into what their mindset was, but I have a feeling that Ruth's mindset was, this is the kind of God that I want to worship. Because the gods that they worshiped were not kind gods. They were vengeful gods. They were petty gods. But here she hears about this Jehovah God, and the God that her husband had worshipped and that her father-in-law had worshipped. And this is the one that she wants to attach herself to. So we know that Ruth, of course, goes back with Naomi, and Ruth ends up marrying Boaz. Okay, all right. So Boaz begot Obed, and Obed begot Jesse. Now, of course, we know Jesse. Who's Jesse? Father of David. And not just father of David, he had many sons. Okay? And remember, the prophet goes, God sends the prophet goes, and he comes to Jesse's house. He says, bring your sons in from the field. So he brings them all in, but he leaves one out in the field, right? Because remember, the prophet, he says, are these all your sons? He said, no, there's David out in the field. So he calls him in, and guess what? Who was going to be the king of Israel? David. You know, and I don't know if Jesse just thought he was too young, too unimportant, and it could have been a protection. I don't, these other boys, but David is special to me. I don't really know what his thought process was, but that's who God was waiting on, and he wasn't going to let the prophet leave until David was brought in. And it said at that point he anointed him king. Didn't make him king at that point, but he anointed him. This was God's protection was over David. And no one could lay a finger on David. Remember, even David said, I forbid for me to stretch out my hand to God's anointed. It was just beyond the pale to touch someone anointed of God. Okay? So, Jesse begat David the king. Now, all of these 14 up until this point are before the kingdom, or before the kingship, I should say. It's a nation of Israel, but it's not a kingdom of Israel. It's just a nation of Israel, because they were being ruled by the judges. There's no king at this point. So all of the 14 up until David were actually patriarchs. Okay, so the 14 before David were the patriarchs of Israel, starting at Abraham and going all the way up through Jesse. Jesse was the last of the true patriarchs that we read about in the Bible. Okay? All right. The second 14 are all kings. So let's look at those just real quickly. All right, David, and we can count David twice. First, he was a patriarch, and second, he was a king, right? Because he wasn't king from birth. He was king from the time that he was anointed. All right. First is a patriarch. Second is one of the kings, and so we make up the full number of the second 14. Okay, so after David begat Solomon of her that had been the wife of Uriah. So the woman Bathsheba, whom David had committed adultery with, actually ends up being one of the ones that listed through that Jesus came through, which also tells us what God will overlook. Okay, when sin is accounted for, God will overlook it. Tells us what? Can we still be of use to God, even no matter how bad our sin has been? God will still restore us, and we can still be of use in the kingdom. Okay, same thing with this. All right. So David begat Solomon of her that had been the wife of Uriah. All right, and Solomon, who was a wise king, but he was very sinful, as we've read in Ecclesiastes, and all the things that he decided he was going to do, to be outside of God and to do the things he wanted to do to prove to himself certain things. So he was a wise, but he was a very sinful king. Hopefully, I think we read in Scripture where he understood his error and came back to God. But Solomon begat Rehoboam. There was Jeroboam and Rehoboam, but who was considered the true and rightful king of Israel? Rehoboam. Jeroboam was what? He was in rebellion. No matter how bad Rehoboam was, and Rehoboam was bad. I mean, he said, "This is what I'm going to do. It's going to be hard I'm going to make it hard on these people." He was still the rightful king of Israel. Jeroboam had no right to split the kingdom, and that's what he did. Which brings us to another lesson. Let's think about this. How does God view those who create division among brethren? He said there are 6 things that God hates, yet 7 are an abomination to him, and one of those is one who incites division among the brethren. A lot of people don't want to accept that. They don't like to hear that. A lot of people think, well, I'm not really creating division. I'm just telling it like it is. But Jeroboam said, let every man away to his own tent. And that's exactly what happened. 10 out of the 12 tribes, 10 of them completely split off and formed their own kingdom. That's how sad it was, the kingdom of Israel. The kingdom of Judah was still in place. Judah and Benjamin were the only ones that were still remaining. All right, so continuing on. Solomon begat Rehoboam. Rehoboam begat Abijah, who was a sinful king like his father Rehoboam. So we know that Rehoboam was sinful in what he did. Abijah begat Asa, who was a godly king, and he reformed the kingdom of Judah. So the kingdom of Israel was always on the outside, right? They were always on the outside. One of the reasons was, where was the city of Jerusalem? In the kingdom of Judah, right? It was in the southern kingdom. So the kingdom of Israel was never able to worship in the way that it was supposed to. So it was always on the outside looking in. It was always in rebellion. It was the kingdom of rebellion. So God's countenance was never shown upon the nation of Israel. Did the nation of Israel ever have a good king? Never. The northern kingdom never had a righteous king. Only the southern kingdom, and I think there was only 3 righteous kings in Judah. Okay? Asa, Josiah, and here's another one. We'll read about it here in just a couple minutes. All right? So Asa was a godly king, and he reformed Judah after it had slid off into a pagan worship and idolatry. Verse 8, and Asa begat Jehoshaphat, who was a good king like Asa, but he displeased God, and he displeased God by doing something that you wouldn't think would be that big of a deal. He displeased God because he was too friendly with Ahab, who was the king of Israel. Remember, God's countenance never shone upon Israel. And God was displeased with Asa because he was on too friendly a term with Ahab, who was the king of Israel at that time. They were not to countenance them. They weren't supposed to be friendly with them. They were in rebellion. It wasn't until they came back. It wasn't until they came back that God would ever allow His countenance. They were the first of the kingdoms to be taken away. It first came through Israel, and then eventually came into Judah. So it shows how displeased God was with this rebellion from Israel. All right. Let's see. Joram. Okay, Asa begat Jehoshaphat and Joram. Joram married Athaliah, who was the wicked daughter of Ahab, and followed Ahab in his ungodly practices. Joram begat Ahaziah, and Ahaziah begat Joash, and this is just talking about some of these descendants. Joash begat Amaziah, and Amaziah begat Uzziah. The names of Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah were probably omitted because of this idea of this kind of symmetry, but they were also dropped because they were wicked descendants of Ahab to the 4th generation. So these people were disregarded. Joram begat Uzziah. Now Uzziah was a good king, but something unusual happened to him. He was struck down with something. What do you think it was? No. Struck down with leprosy. There was a reason he was struck down with leprosy, because he disregarded the law. He entered into the temple in an ungodly fashion, in an unrighteous fashion. He entered into it basically not humbling himself beforehand. And he was smitten with leprosy. He presumptuously entered the temple. Let's see, I'm trying to find, I don't think I wrote down the scripture. Like I said, we're going to go back over a lot of this. Uzziah begat Jotham, a good king like Uzziah's father. Jotham begat Ahaz. Ahaz was one of Judah's worst kings. There were only a couple that were as bad as Ahaz. Ahaz begat Hezekiah. We know Hezekiah, right? Was Hezekiah a good king or a bad king? He was a good king. One of the few in that line that continued to remain faithful to God. Hezekiah was a good king, and we're thankful that he had that kind of influence. Hezekiah, unfortunately, begat Manasseh. And Manasseh was one of the worst kings that Judah had ever seen. He was a terrible king. But toward the end, what did Manasseh do? What did he do? He repented. He realized the error. God showed him the error that he was involved in, and Manasseh, one of the worst kings, they said that the streets ran with blood under Manasseh. He said the blood of innocent men ran in the streets. He was an evil, evil, evil king. However, he realized his evil behavior, He realized that he was outside of God, and he actually repented and came back. And did God forgive him? Yeah, as he always does. He did. He continued to remember. And Manasseh, unfortunately, begat Amon. And Amon was an evil king like his father Manasseh. And the problem with Amon was he got worse and worse. He never repented. He got worse and worse and worse until his people actually rose up and killed him. They committed what we would call regicide. They killed their king. God was not pleased with the people for doing that. Even though he was an evil king, he was still the king. And he told them this. And this is one of the reasons that when God warns us against something, when we think that something's good, when God says that it's bad, who should we rely on? God's opinion or our own? He told them this was going to happen. You know, these men are not always going to be good people. They're going to do awful things to you and to each other. And if you'll just accept my rule, you're going to be fine. And they didn't want to do that. They wanted their king, and they got their king. And unfortunately, many of them were evil, and they did terrible things to their brethren. All right, so his people conspired against him, and they killed him. Amon begat, however, as bad as he was, who did he begat? Amon begat Josiah. Josiah was one of the greats because he was a young man when he came to the kingship. And from the very beginning, until when he got old enough to understand that that the children of God had fallen so far away, he instituted the kind of reforms that you read about him and your heart feels good, because this is a young man who said, I want to be righteous. I want God's people to be righteous. We're going to institute all of the feasts. We're going to institute all the festivals. We're going to dress right. We're going to worship correctly. It's not enough for us to just start worshiping correctly. All of the things that we use to worship incorrectly are going to be torn down. All of the shrines and all of the things that were going on all over the kingdom, I want those things torn down. I want them burned. I want them destroyed. The evil priests, I want them dead. We want to completely rid Judah of all of the evil. So his reforms went they were deep reaching. It wasn't just, hey, let's start worshiping again. It's like anything that kept us from worshiping correctly, we're going to tear apart. I want it gone. So Josiah was truly one of the great kings of Judah. Unfortunately, Josiah begat Jehoiakim, and Jehoiakim begat Jeconiah. Okay, I'll tell you what, let's stop there. Let's stop there, and we'll pick up, because that's right about to the point of the carrying away to Babylon. What we'll do is we'll come back next week, and we'll get a couple little bit more tidbits. There's a lot of really neat stuff there's some meat still on the bones. So what we'll come back, next week we'll go over these just a little bit more, talk about some specific things that shed some light on the Messiahship, because there's some important things. We're getting an invitation song here real quick. Any questions so far? Any questions? All right. Okay. We're going to have a song of invitation. Okay. 95. If you'll turn song number 95, we'll have our invitation. If there's anyone here who needs to respond to the Lord's invitation, it was so nice to have Cameron and Lisa respond this morning. That's something I've been praying about for quite some time, and they've decided that they want to remain faithful. It's like I said, it's interesting what children will do to you. They'll make you rethink everything that you do. And it was great to see them this morning and have them do that. But there may be someone here this evening that needs to repent of sin. If there's something that's going on that we need to pray about, problems that you're having, issues that you're having, we want to do that as well. So if there's any need at all, please come while we stand and while we sing.